The January wind came down off the mountains like a living thing, sliding between the boards of every shack and cabin, gnawing its way through wool, leather, and bone. Snow had been falling for days without pause, and in the valley below, the small cluster of farms sat buried under drifts as high as a man's waist. Folks in these parts were used to hardship, but this winter was different. It had a cruelty to it, the sort that didn't just take what it needed, but lingered to watch you break. Elias Cole had been out since dawn, his snowshoes creaking over the crusted powder as he checked the traplines strung along the aspen grove. The tall, broad-shouldered mountain man carried himself like a man who knew how to survive alone, yet his eyes, grey as a winter morning, had a quiet watchfulness, as if he was always listening for trouble that didn't belong to the woods. By mid-afternoon he had little to show for his work: 2 rabbits, half-starved, and a fox so thin he wondered how it had lived this long. The sky had gone to lead and the light was draining fast, when he heard something over the moan of the wind. Not a branch breaking, not an animal's cry. A human voice. It was faint, muffled, and broken, like someone calling from under a heavy quilt of snow. Elias stopped, head cocked, breath fogging the air. The sound came again, carried from the direction of the Miller farm, an old barn that hadn't seen a horse in years. He didn't much like the Millers. Folks whispered about their tempers, and he'd seen enough bruises on the eldest boy's wife to know the talk wasn't just talk. But the sound coming from that barn wasn't something a man could ignore. He moved toward it, boots crunching through drifts, the wind needling at his face. When he reached the barn, he saw the door was padlocked from the outside. Snow had piled against it, and frost clung to the iron like white moe. As the sound came again, a low, shivering sob. Elias stepped closer and put his ear to the wood. "Hello?" he called. For a moment, nothing. Then a voice so hoarse it barely carried. "Help! Please!" He felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. He pulled the Bowie knife from his belt and scraped away the ice from the lock, but the thing was solid steel, frozen shut. It would take more than a blade to open it. That's when he saw the gap between the boards, narrow, but enough to glimpse what was inside, and what he saw made the hair on his neck rise. A woman, thin as a rail, her hair tangled and matted to her face, wrists chained to a beam overhead. She wore nothing but a thin dress, her bare feet sunk into a crust of ice on the dirt floor. Her lips were cracked and pale, but her eyes, wild and pleading, fixed on him like he was the last soul in the world. Something hot and sharp flared in Elias's chest. He didn't think. He just acted. He stepped back, planted his boots, and slammed the heel of his axe down onto the lock, once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th, the metal gave with a shriek, snapping clean. The door swung inward, and the wind roared in behind him. The woman flinched at the sudden cold, but Elias was already moving toward her. The chain around her wrists rattled, biting into her skin, and he swore under his breath as he lifted the axe again. The links snapped, and her hands fell limp against her sides. "You can walk?" he asked, crouching to meet her eyes. She shook her head weakly. "No." He slid an arm under her knees, another behind her back, and lifted her like she weighed nothing at all. She gave a small cry at the movement, whether from pain or shock he couldn't tell, but then she was pressing her face into his chest, shivering violently. The barn was already growing darker as the snow thickened outside. Elias stepped into it without looking back, carrying her through the drifts toward the black line of pines where his cabin waited. The wind clawed at them both, but Elias kept going. Whatever had been done to her in that barn, no winter, no man, no devil was going to put her back there again. The snowstorm hit them full in the face as Elias trudged through the drifts, the woman cradled in his arms like a half-broken bird. She weighed next to nothing, but the dead weight of exhaustion made her feel heavier with each step. Her breath was shallow against his chest, and more than once he had to glance down to make sure she was still breathing at all. He kept his head down and his stride steady, aiming for the shadowy line of pines that marked the edge of his land. His cabin sat on the far side of the trees, tucked away where the wind was kinder, but the climb up the slope was slow work. "You just hold on," he murmured. though he wasn't sure she could hear him. Her eyes had closed, and her head lolled against his shoulder. The pines swallowed them, muting the wind, and the familiar crunch of snow under his boots took on a different tone, damp, muffled, until finally, through the branches, the dark square of his cabin came into view. The chimney was cold. He'd left before dawn without banking the fire, and now the place would be near as frigid as the storm outside. But cold or not, it was shelter. Elias shouldered the door open and stepped inside, letting it thump shut behind him. The air was sharp with the scent of pine resin and cold iron. He laid her gently on the bed, just a narrow frame against the far wall covered in thick wool blankets, and went straight for the hearth. His hands moved fast, stacking kindling, striking the flint until sparks caught. Soon the fire was snapping and throwing orange light across the room. He glanced back at her. She hadn't moved. Elias crossed to the bed and began peeling off the ragged dress that clung to her like frost-bitten bark. He hesitated only a moment, then pulled one of his old wool shirts over her head. It hung loose nearly to her knees. He wrapped the blankets around her, tucking them in tight. Her skin was ice-cold, mottled with bruises that made his teeth clench. Both wrists were raw where the iron had bitten into them, and her bare feet. He didn't like the look of them at all. He poured water from his kettle into a basin and set it near the fire, waiting for it to warm. While it heated, he reached into the small cupboard by the wall and pulled out a jar of bear fat and another of dried yarrow. The fat would trap warmth in her skin. The yarrow would help with the broken surface of her wrists. When the water was ready, he dipped a cloth into it and began working gently over her hands and feet. The first touch made her flinch, and her eyes flicked open, dazed, unsure. "You're safe," he said quietly. "Name's Elias. You're in my cabin. Nobody's gonna hurt you here." For a moment her gaze wandered, as if she was checking the corners for something or someone. Then her eyes locked on his, and her lips moved. "They'll come." Her voice was thin as smoke, barely audible over the fire's crackle. "Not tonight they won't," Elias said. He went back to cleaning her wrists, careful with the torn skin. "You got a name?" She hesitated. "Hannah." "Well, Hannah," he said, "I reckon you and me are gonna get you warm first. Then we'll talk about the rest." He worked in silence after that, rubbing her hands and feet with the warm cloth, then the bear fat, until the mottled blue faded back towards something like living flesh. She watched him without speaking, her eyes flicking to the door now and then. When he finished, he ladled out a tin cup of broth from the pot hanging over the fire, a thin rabbit stew from the night before. He slid an arm behind her shoulders and helped her sit up enough to drink. The first sip made her cough, but she drank the rest slowly, like someone who'd been too cold to feel hunger until now. "You were in that barn how long?" Elias asked once she'd swallowed the last of it. Her fingers tightened in the blanket. 3 days, maybe 4. I can't. She shook her head. "They took my coat, my shoes, said I wasn't worth feeding." Elias's jaw worked. "Who's they?" "The Millers." Her eyes went hard. "Wasn't enough I wouldn't marry their son. Said I owed them work for the food I'd eaten under their roof." She gave a bitter laugh that had no humor in it. "Work meant keeping my mouth shut and doing what I was told. And when you didn't, they chained me in the barn." The way she said it, flat, as if she'd already spent every drop of outrage she had, hit Elias in a way he didn't like. There was resignation in it, the kind of acceptance that comes after too much bad weather and too little shelter. "Well," he said, tossing another log onto the fire, "they won't chain you again." Her gaze lingered on him, weighing the truth in his words. For the first time, he saw the faintest crack in her guarded expression, something like disbelief and hope mixed together. Outside, the storm howled against the walls, but in here, the fire's glow wrapped around them. Elias sat back in the chair by the hearth, watching her as her eyes drifted closed again. Elias woke before dawn, as he always did, though this morning it wasn't the creak of the cabin settling or the howl of the wind that stirred him. It was the silence. The storm had passed. No more wind battering the shutters, no snow hissing against the roof. Outside, the world would be buried in fresh drifts, the kind that made every sound sharp and close. He rolled out of bed quietly, careful not to wake Hannah, and stoked the fire. The embers had burned low, but with a few splits of pine and a good poke, the flames were back, licking the black iron pot. He took a slow look at her. She was still curled under the blankets, face turned toward the fire. Her breathing was steadier now. Color had returned to her cheeks, though the bruises were still there, ugly and purple. Elias poured himself a mug of hot water with a pinch of spruce tips and sat at the table listening. That's when he heard it, faint at first, then clearer. The crunch of boots on snow, heavy ones, more than one pair. He set the mug down without drinking and reached for the rifle hanging above the door. The old Winchester was oiled and loaded, same as it always was, but he worked the lever just to hear the smooth click of a round sliding into place. Through the frost-rimmed window he saw 3 figures trudging up the path from the pines. They moved slow but steady, their shoulders hunched against the cold. Even from here Elias knew who they were. The Millers. The biggest of them, Luke Miller, was in the lead, his red scarf stark against his black coat. Behind him came his younger brother, Wade, and the old man himself, Thomas Miller, leaning on a hickory stick more for show than support. They didn't come with smiles. Elias stepped to the bed and touched Hannah's shoulder. "Stay quiet," he murmured. Her eyes opened instantly, the fear flashing before she could hide it. "They're here? They're here." She pulled the blanket tighter around her and sat up, but he saw her glance toward the back corner of the cabin, as if half expecting to need a place to hide. Elias didn't tell her to run. There was nowhere to go. The knock came, loud and hard enough to rattle the door on its hinges. Elias opened it just far enough to stand in the gap, rifle held at a low angle, not aimed yet, but ready. "Mornin'," Luke Miller said, though there was nothing polite in his voice. His breath steamed in the cold. "We come for the girl." "She's not yours," Elias said. "She's ours until she pays her debt." That was the old man, his eyes sharp under the brim of his hat. "She walked away from work she owed. You know what that means under parish law." Elias shook his head. "A chain in a barn ain't law. That's just cruelty." Luke, his jaw tightened. "Not your concern." "It is now." There was a pause. Snow creaked under their boots as they shifted their weight. Wade's hand rested on the butt of his pistol, but he didn't draw. Luke glanced past Elias toward the bed, where the blanket-covered shape of Hannah was barely visible in the firelight. "You think you can keep her warm out here all winter? Think you can feed her, protect her, and deal with us coming every day till you hand her back?" Elias didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, let them feel the weight of it. The only sound was the fire popping inside. When he finally spoke, his voice was even. "If you want her, you'll have to step inside, but you won't be walking back out with her." That made Wade take a step forward, but Luke put out a hand to stop him. The old man was watching Elias now, his eyes narrowing. "You'd raise a gun against your own neighbors?" "Against anyone who comes to take what ain't theirs," Elias said. Luke's mouth curved into a thin, humorless smile. "We'll see about that." They didn't try to force it, not today. Maybe the snow was too deep, maybe the cold was already biting at them, maybe they just didn't like the look in Elias's eyes. But whatever the reason, Luke stepped back, and the 3 of them turned away without another word. Elias watched until they vanished into the pines. Only then did he close the door and set the rifle back on its hook. Hannah was still sitting up, watching him. "They'll come back. I know. They won't just knock next time. I know that too." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire snapped, throwing shadows across the log walls. Elias didn't sleep much after the Millers left. Every creak of the logs, every groan of the wind in the rafters felt like the sound of boots approaching again. But when morning came and the sunlight spilled through the frost on the windows, there was still nothing moving outside except the long, slow drift of snow off the pines. He sat at the table sharpening his knife while Hannah stirred from the bed. She was moving better now, slow, but without the glassy look she'd worn the first 2 days. "You didn't sleep," she said. "Some," he lied. Her eyes went to the rifle by the door. "They'll wait for the right day, not too cold, not too warm, when the trail's packed enough for their horses. That's when we'll be ready." She studied him for a moment before speaking again. "You keep saying we." "That's because it's both of us," Elias said. "You're not a burden, Hannah. You're part of this now." Her gaze dropped to her hands. The bruises along her wrists were fading from black to yellow, but the thin grooves where the iron had rubbed her raw would take longer to heal. Elias stood, went to the cupboard, and pulled down a small jar of bear grease. "For the skin," he said, setting it beside her. "Why are you helping me?" she asked softly. Elias paused, not because he didn't know the answer, but because the truth wasn't something he said often. "Because I know what it's like to be left out in the cold and told you deserve it." The wind outside shifted, and in it, Elias heard the sound of brittle branches snapping somewhere down the slope. Not close enough to be the miller's, not yet, but it put him on edge. The next few days were spent turning the cabin from a home into a stronghold. Elias showed Hannah how to stack split logs along the walls for both insulation and cover. They gathered every piece of iron scrap he had, old hinges, bent nails, a bit of stovepipe, and set them into small piles for quick work later. In the back, Elias dug out a narrow trench that ran from the cabin to the woodshed. It wasn't much, but it would give them cover if they had to move outside during a fight. At first, Hannah could only carry small armloads of wood, but each day she took more, her shoulders straightening with the work. She didn't complain about the cold. Elias noticed she never asked for more blankets, just stayed near the fire when she needed warmth. Finally, Elias sat back down at the table. On the fifth day, while they were hauling water from the creek, she spoke without looking at him. "I didn't owe them anything," she said. "They said I did, but it was just their way of keeping me there. I worked the miller's land for 2 years. My father owed them money when he died. I paid it off, every cent, but when I told them I was leaving..." Her voice tightened. She stopped walking, the bucket of water swinging from her hand. Luke laughed, said I could go, but not before he had what he thought was his due, and when I fought him off he chained me in that barn, said I'd rot there till I learned my place. Elias's grip tightened on his own bucket handle. "They won't touch you again." "You can't promise that," she said. "I can," he said, and I just did. That night, snow fell again, light feathery flakes that built slowly on the roof. The wind was calm, the kind that made the forest too quiet. Elias was oiling the rifle when Hannah stepped beside him. "You're expecting them tonight." "I'm expecting them soon," he said, "and that means everything needs to be within arm's reach." She looked at the rifle, then at him. "Teach me." It wasn't a question. Elias hesitated only a second before handing it to her. She handled it carefully, her fingers stiff but steady. He showed her how to check the chamber, how to work the lever without losing her grip, how to set her feet so the recoil didn't throw her. When she fired the first practice shot into the snowbank behind the shed, the sound cracked through the stillness like a breaking tree. Somewhere in the distance, a raven called once and then went silent. Hannah lowered the rifle and glanced toward the dark tree line. If they were close, they heard that. "Good," Elias said. "Let them know we're not asleep in here." They went back inside. The fire burned low, but neither of them added wood right away. They just sat, each listening for something neither could name but both expected. When it came, it was faint, just the crunch of a branch outside, followed by another. Not wind, not deer. Elias reached for the rifle and looked at Hannah. "It's time." The snow under their boots gave them away. Elias had been listening for hours, his back against the wall, rifle resting across his knees, when the sound began to thread through the quiet. A steady, deliberate crunch. Not the skitter of an animal, not the haphazard pacing of a lost traveler. This was a rhythm with weight behind it. He looked to Hannah, who was crouched by the hearth. She didn't need him to speak. Her hands went to the rifle they'd set for her, the one she'd practiced with until her shoulder was sore. Elias blew out the lantern. The cabin went to shadow. The first knock wasn't a knock at all, more like the heel of a hand striking the wood hard enough to rattle the latch. "Open up, Elias," Luke Miller's voice called, low and mocking. "We come to talk like neighbors." Hannah stiffened. Elias kept his voice level. "Neighbors don't chain women in barns." Silence, then the faint crunch of boots shifting outside. "She's ours by law," Luke said, "and you're keeping what don't belong to you." "She belongs to herself," Elias said. "Now get off my land." Something hit the wall to the left of the door, an axe head biting shallow just enough to mark the wood. A warning, not yet an attack. "You can't keep the fire burning forever, mountain man," Luke called. "One day you'll step outside and we'll be here." Elias caught Hannah's eyes in the dim. She wasn't frozen. She was coiled tight, watching the shadows near the window. The sound of boots began to circle the cabin. 2, maybe 3 men. A deliberate walk, testing for weak points. Elias stayed silent, letting them make the next move. It came quick. Glass shattering. In the back window, a hand reached through, fumbling for the latch. Elias fired a shot into the rafters above it. The report boomed through the cabin. The hand vanished. A curse rang out in the dark, followed by Luke's voice again. "You're making this harder than it has to be, Elias." "I'm counting on it," Elias said. For a moment, the night went still again. Then the pounding came, this time at the door, hard enough to bow it inward with each strike. Hannah moved to the side wall, rifle ready, just as Elias had told her. If they breached, she'd have a clear line to the entry without standing in front of it. The next blow came with a crack, the top hinge tearing loose. Elias glanced at her. Now. 2 shots went off, hers first, into the snow just outside the doorframe. His second, higher splintering wood above Luke's head. The sudden noise and flying chips sent the men scrambling back. "Get to the trench," Elias said. They slipped out the back, low to the ground, using the dugout path to reach the woodshed. From there they could see shapes moving at the front of the cabin, dark against the snow, pacing, regrouping. One of them called out, "We can wait till morning." "They won't," Elias murmured. "They'll push before the cold eats them." Sure enough, within minutes, 2 figures broke from the group and charged the door. Elias steadied his rifle over the stacked logs beside the shed. Hannah did the same. The first man went down before he hit the porch, Elias's shot catching him in the leg. The second ducked but stumbled when Hannah's bullet tore into the snow at his feet, forcing him back, shouting, cursing, and then, finally, the retreat, boots crunching away, fading into the timberline. The wind filled the silence they left. Hannah's breath came fast, clouds of it drifting in the cold air. She kept her rifle up until Elias touched her arm. "They'll think on this," he said, "and when they do, they'll decide it ain't worth freezing or bleeding for." For the first time since he'd pulled her out of that barn, she smiled, just a small, tired curve of her lips. "You said you'd keep your promise." "I always do," Elias said. They waited another hour before going back inside. The fire had sunk to embers, but the cabin still held its warmth. Elias stoked it back to life while Hannah checked the door's splintered hinge. "Not much of a door now," she said. "It'll hold until we make a better one," Elias replied, "and when spring comes, maybe we build something bigger." She looked at him, a question in her eyes. "You mean together?" Elias met her gaze. "If you want." Hannah was silent for a moment, then nodded. "I think I do." Outside, the snow began again, soft, steady, and without hurry. The mountain was quiet. For now,